There are broadly two areas around M&A that we'd like to see. One relates to the actual activity of acquiring a company, either in Singapore or outside Singapore. What we'd like to see is really a broadening of the current tax incentive. Firstly, the removal of a couple of restrictions around the ownership of the acquiring company, that the need for it to be ultimately a Singapore company should be removed, or international headquarters company, I think, should be removed. Basically, it should be broadened up to encourage the buyers to actually look to increase profitability in the companies, and for the incentive, the deductions under the incentive to be allowed to be offset on perhaps on a group basis, so that the wider group can enjoy that incentive as opposed to just purely the acquiring company. Because very much the economics around a deal don't just affect the holding company's position. It can sometimes affect the sister companies, especially where you're making an acquisition for the creation of synergies and to provide for a wider footprint, or basically a wider market. Secondly, the other side relates to the actual target itself. The incentives currently are very much focused on acquisition costs. However, we must look at greater value creation around an M&A. And very much, a lot of the value is actually in the target itself. And there are incentives right now in other parts of the world which allow for a step up of the value of the targets. Because a net book value may be, let's say, 50, but the true value, the enterprise value, could be a lot higher, 6 times higher, maybe even at 300. The difference between the 250 and the 50 right now under a share deal is not available as a deduction. It's not available in terms of amortization. The only really incentive which does allow for a deduction relates to qualifying intellectual property. But that, again, the current structure is a bit restrictive because it only allows it where the qualifying IP is separately acquired before the share deal is done, and then there's some deductions available. At the same time, deductions relating to interest costs incurred to buy shares is also not available. So therefore, when it comes to financing a deal, the only financing costs which are allowed as a deduction only relates to an asset deal. And in truth, many M&As revolve around share deals, not asset deals. So as a result, these the values around the target company are simply not unlocked in terms of reducing the cost of acquisition, and more importantly also the risks of acquisition, because all M&As come with some inherent risks. And so therefore targets in Singapore are not as attractive as targets elsewhere in more developed tax jurisdictions. So I think the incentive really needs to focus on two areas, as I mentioned. One is the acquisition cost itself, going out to buy. Second part relates to acquisition cost, but more in terms of the locked-in value, or the value which you're trying to unlock as a result of the M&A. M&A can serve many purposes in that respect. One of them being the fact that many companies undertake acquisitions to gain a footprint in Singapore and wider and still in Asia. If the M&A incentives can be tailored to tie in with some of the current incentives around growth, such as the DEI, the Development Expansion Incentive, here you can incentivize companies to really bring more activities into Singapore, to bring more assets into Singapore, to bring more C-suite decision makers into Singapore as part of this M&A. So a company wanting to move to Asia looks to acquire a group which is headquartered in Singapore, which has a holding company in Singapore, holding activities in Singapore. But then you incentivize them further as part of the M&A. It says, fine, you make this acquisition, you bring in more activities, you bring in more personnel, and therefore you bring in more profits into Singapore. If that's incentivized as a whole M&A EDB, DEI type incentive, then lies the opportunity to say, fine, make an acquisition, develop a footprint, build profits here at this part of the world, and will provide you the relevant incentives. I think M&A does provide that catalyst and that starting point for companies, like I said, looking to start here in Singapore, in Asia, or even expand in Asia.